You'll hear a lot of people these days talk about spiritual warfare, but medieval monks took it to an entirely different level. Monasteries in the Middle Ages weren't for the faint of heart. They were meant to mold you into something different, to strip away your connection to the world and bring you into closer contact with the divine. In this video, we're going to break down the extreme practices you would encounter behind the walls of a medieval monastery, from intense sleep deprivation to physical battles with demons and even spending the night with corpses to keep reminders of death ever present. Let's travel back through the centuries and see if you have what it takes to survive as a monk in one of these sacred places where deprivation was welcomed and the soul was seen as both God and the devil's most desired possession. If you know anything about monasticism, you've probably heard of the vow of silence, where monks would go long periods of time without speaking at all and would communicate with each other via hand signals or written messages. These days, people go on silent retreats where they won't speak for 48 hours straight, and that's seen as some kind of example of extreme discipline, but obviously medieval monks would laugh at such nonsense. There were different monastic orders in medieval Europe, and one of the strictest was the Carthusians, who observed nearly perpetual silence. This meant each individual monk was left alone with his own mind, and sometimes when you're pushing yourself towards a higher spirituality, it makes you a greater target for exactly the kind of forces you're trying to overcome. Medieval monastic tradition held that the holier the life, the more demonic attention it would attract. Contemporary chronicles record how monks truly believed that demons prowled the lonely hallways of the monasteries, and these kinds of accounts were taken completely at face value. One interesting aside about medieval chronicles is that you'll see historical recordings like the date of a battle or the lineage of a noble family, alongside writings about miracles and demonic attacks, and both types of narratives are meant to be taken as equally factual. This gives us an important insight into the medieval mind, and from these monastic chronicles we can see how a lifestyle of extreme spirituality and asceticism influenced the day-to-day experience of these monks. The Cluniac monks of the 11th century, for example, recorded how on their abbot Audilo's deathbed, growling demonic voices could be heard by the monks attending him as he battled them off with prayer. The monks would work together to rid themselves of these demons, and the fact that they experienced them in solitude but also collectively does seem to rule out the obvious explanation of simple hallucination. Sometimes demonic attacks were so powerful that prayer and fasting weren't enough to overcome them. The Lossiac history and other monastic writings tell of hermits who hurled themselves into rose bushes or spent nights in graveyards to overcome demon-induced fears. You won't hear any modern therapist recommend these practices as treatment strategies if you tell them you've been battling your demons, but next time you see a rose bush, it might be worth a shot. Just explain to your horrified friends that you've been binging medieval mindset videos. Monks in the Middle Ages didn't just think of themselves as these robed figures whose job it was to pray and work and grow closer to Christ. They also saw themselves as deeply embroiled in constant warfare, with the entire spiritual realm as well as the physical world being a place where demonic temptation could lead you down paths you'd never return from. As one modern scholar puts it, the medieval monk's quiet cell was not a place of peaceful reflection, it was a place of spiritual combat. Because of this, medieval monks lived in constant awareness of death and embraced it as a spiritual teacher rather than fleeing from it. These days, we're so separated from death that it almost seems like this foreign concept that only happens in hospitals, but medieval people as a whole were surrounded by it and were forced to constantly reckon with the fact that it could come knocking at any time. One of the ways this materialized for monks was the corpse vigil. When a brother in the monastery died, it was customary for the others to sit in prayerful watch over the body through the night until the funeral. This was an act of charity for the departed soul, but it also confronted the living with mortality in a visceral way. In an age before any kind of modern medical treatment, death was always around the corner, and the body of your fellow brother was a sobering reminder that you could be next, so it would behoove you to get right with the Almighty. Some monastic accounts even speak of extreme ascetics who would literally sleep in the presence of corpses, like solitary hermits spending the night in tombs to overcome their fear of death. That's one you'll also find in accounts from the early Desert Fathers. Those cases are more so the exception than the rule, and most monks didn't spend the cold medieval nights spooning a cadaver, but the mentality behind them was widespread. Memento Mori. Looking at the Cistercians, another monastic order, they would teach novices that before they fell asleep each night, they should think of Christ's burial and their own and compare their bed to the grave. Pretty heavy stuff to be thinking about instead of counting sheep, but it was meant to keep your mind on eternity and off of your short physical life. The rule of Saint Benedict urged monks to keep death daily before their eyes. Throughout Western Europe, this Memento Mori motif became ingrained in monastic culture. Monks commonly kept symbols of death in their cells, like a skull on their desk or a coffin that they had built for themselves, as a constant reminder of life's brevity. A lot of art from the High Middle Ages and beyond often shows thinkers and philosophers with a human skull close at hand, which signifies this whole concept. We might think this is more than a little weird, but medieval monks didn't see it that way at all. They considered this remembrance of death as a pathway to holiness. A Carthusian motto summed it up nicely: Stat crux dum volvitur orbis. The cross stands firm while the world turns. In the stillness of the cloister, even sleeping by a corpse became a serene contemplation of the cross and resurrection. In a society terrified of the plague and high mortality, monks offered a countercultural witness. Embrace death with hope, make every evening a rehearsal for eternity, and you'll never truly be broken by fear. We've talked about death, and as Nas famously said, sleep is the cousin of death, which gives us a nice segue into our next topic. Medieval monks purposely broke their nightly sleep in half as part of their strict monastic schedule. According to Benedictine custom, monks went to bed around 8 or 9 p.m., then they'd rise at midnight for matins, and only after a few hours of prayer would they then hit the hay for a brief second sleep before the dawn service. A 12th century summary notes, matins was at midnight, lauds at 3 a.m., prime at 6 a.m., then bedtime, then the monks went to bed at 8 p.m. in the winter and they slept fully clothed. The rule of St. Benedict mandated that monks sleep separately in separate beds, that a candle would always be burning, and that they should sleep fully clothed, girded up with belts and ropes, and when the signal is given, they should rise without delay, letting them hasten to the work of God. In practice, this meant that you were never going to get a fully conked out 8 hours. Sleep was short, it was frequently interrupted, and it was purposefully uncomfortable. Some of these stricter orders even did away with bedding entirely, and monks were left to sleep fully clothed on a simple board. The Carthusians, our perpetually silent friends, lived such austere lifestyles that an early 12th century observer wrote, "They hardly ever speak, and if they want anything, they ask for it by a sign. They wear a hair shirt next to their skin, and their other garments are thin and scanty." Even at night, a Carthusian monk remained in his itchy habit in an ice-cold cell. Monastic dormitories were unheated stone rooms, sometimes literally in an abbey's freezing crypt, so in winter a monk would wake up to the kind of cold that would make us modern soft serves hunker down under the covers. Keep in mind all of this was intentional. Medieval monks saw excessive comfort, especially oversleeping, as a threat to the soul. Within the monastic mindset, sleeping on hard boards in your habit and shivering through midnight service was a form of spiritual warfare, a nightly combat against the fleshly comfort of sleep, meant to fight against the devil of laziness and keep the monk's soul vigilant. To put it simply, sleep was never about comfort in medieval monasteries. It was a matter of discipline and sacrifice. So were medieval monasteries sacred places to temper the soul into something greater and more pure, or were they simply madhouses isolated from the outside world? Monks did push themselves to extremes, but it wasn't in the name of showing off, and only the modern mind would consider their lifestyles to be the result of any kind of mental illness. Monastic life broke medieval men in a way, but then it built them back up into servants of God who weren't concerned with their own physical comfort. Compare that to pretty much any aspect of modern life, where we're completely addicted to comfort and avoid hardship at every turn, and you've got a really interesting contrast between different times and places. I'm not saying we should sleep beside corpses in solitary cells and have boxing matches with the devil, but introducing a bit of friction and voluntary hardship into our lives might be good for our souls in the long run. Monasticism was hugely influential on medieval spirituality as a whole, so it's important to remember that this kind of approach to Christianity wasn't solely restricted to the walls of the monasteries, nor do its lessons have to be restricted to the Middle Ages. But what do you think? Was monastery life too brutal to be truly productive, or is there something we can learn from the lifestyle of these monks? Let me know in the comments. As always, I'm John, this has been Medieval Mindset, and remember, the past isn't gone, it's simply waiting to be rediscovered.